Hello everyone, welcome back to the EGPP Seminar Series. I see some new faces with great pleasure. For those who join us for the first time, my name is Daniele Caramani and I will be chairing the session today. The EGPP Seminar Series combines various types of seminars, and today's session is a seminar of the EU Studies Working Group, which is organized by EUI researchers. And for EGPP, this is very important, in particular to keep a contact with and involve researchers from the various departments. Today's presenter is Lucas Schramm, a researcher of the SPS department with a paper on Europe will be built through crisis, explaining the variation in outcomes of crisis for European integration. Given the many crises that are ongoing, this is a very timely seminar. So thank you very much, Lucas, for your availability and also for your involvement in the organization of the seminar series, and obviously also for presenting your research. Unfortunately, we continue to hold the seminars fully online. Tuscany is still orange zone. This makes it impossible to meet in person or even to have a hybrid seminar. I have no doubt that it will nonetheless be an engaging and stimulating seminar. I very much look forward to it, and the seminars we had recently proved that it is possible to have very good presentations and discussions even if we are online only. Lucas, you will give an initial presentation of about 30 to 40 minutes. Take your time, go through your materials without looking at the clock. The important thing is that you're able to go through your material thoroughly so that we can then go straight to Q&A and give you comments and ask questions. So for those attending, please keep your microphones muted, but the video switched on if possible. And then during Q&A, you can use the hand function if you want to ask a question or make a comment, or write in the chat. I will see both. Thank you all for being with us today, and especially to our speaker. Lucas, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Daniele, for this nice introductory words and for giving me the opportunity to present today. And thank you all for joining. I'm going to share my screen now because I have the PowerPoint presentation. Let's see if this works. Yeah, so you should all see my screen now.
Yes.
Actually, it's more than a paper. I should say it's a presentation on my ongoing thesis, a PhD thesis, which I hope will be a monograph on one day. So obviously, this is very much a work in progress. So I'm looking forward and will be very grateful for your questions and suggestions afterwards. So the provisional title of my PhD project is Europe will be built through crisis. Obviously, a quote taken from Jean Monnet, but here with a question mark. And the subtitle reads, Explaining the Variation in the Outcomes of Crisis of European Integration. This is the agenda for the next 30-35 minutes. So I'm going to present the motivation for my study. I'm going to present a research puzzle and my main research question. I will then provide you with some definitions and my case selection, present my theoretical framework, say a few words about methodology, and also present some preliminary findings. So to start with, obviously, very recently, crises have featured prominently in the discourse and also in the academic literature due to the EU's recent polycrisis, or what has been termed polycrisis, going on since at the latest 2008 with the Eurozone crisis. So we see a lot of scholarly interest in crisis of European integration, and there was as I find, particularly stimulating academic debate discussions on the Eurozone crisis and migration crisis and comparison between different crises. And I should maybe also say that was also the starting point of my PhD project, but since then I've taken a broader picture, as I will explain in this presentation, because
Lucas,
yeah.
Lucas, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we can't see you.
You can't see me.
We can see your slides.
Okay.
We cannot see you. It's a pity because you're the speaker.
You should be able, Lucas, you should be able just to activate your camera.
Let me check. Where, Sarah? I can't find it.
If you hover in your, if you exit out of full screen from the Zoom in the upper right-hand corner, and then go to the lower part of your dashboard at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the dashboard that says mute, start video, etc.
Yes.
And you should be able to start your video.
I see the dashboard, but I'm not managing to switch on the camera for some reason.
That is unusual. Would you like to exit out of share screen? And if anything, I can, if you...
Yeah.
And then try to turn on your camera now.
No, unfortunately, it doesn't work.
Okay. Well,
you let me know how you'd like to proceed. If you'd like to continue without the camera, or
it's
with.
a pity because we're recording and it's the speaker.
Right.
But I think we can proceed also without the camera.
Shall I try to log in again? Shall I leave this?
We can try that. Why don't we do that? And I'll pause the recording for a moment.
All right.
Okay. Difficulties. So I was saying crises obviously feature quite prominently at the moment in the academic debate, but at the same time, crises have always been a part of European integration. And we might even say that every decade since the beginning of European integration had its crisis, or even crises in plural. And what we also see is a kind of conventional wisdom or popular narrative in the tradition of Monet, that crises are perceived as beneficial in the way that they lead to more integration. However, the empirics actually suggest that there is much more variation in crisis outcomes. Despite the broad literature on crisis of European integration, what so far is rather missing is a systematic, which means an overall and also comparative assessment of major European integration crises and their outcomes. So what we see is that political scientists have focused a lot on the more recent crisis. Historians have focused on past individual crises. And there are some book chapters or journal articles that take a more systematic overall approach, but so far they are rather superficial since they are very short assessments. So this is where I saw a gap to fill, and this is what I'm trying to do in my PhD dissertation. So I seek to go beyond the more recent polycrisis and try to identify major crises, their outcomes, as well as their impact on integration and the EU as a polity. Let me now move more concretely to the research puzzle and the research question. When looking at crisis of European integration, we see different approaches to crisis. They differ in their understanding of crisis, of integration, and also on the relationship between crisis and integration, and the role that crises are supposed to play. So one approach can be captured as an institutionalist or legalist approach. So scholars here focus on the three dimension of deepening, broadening, and widening of European integration in the aftermath of crisis. This mostly is assessed in terms of shifts in policy competences and in the legal basis, not least in EU primary law. A second approach, I termed here more optimistic, is that crises are assumed to lead to more integration without very often explicitly made clear what this more integration actually means. Then a third approach, some scholars have also argued that crises actually have little impact on European integration, and that there are other drivers for integration, for further integration, namely certain ideas or the role of individual leaders. And finally, this is more recent, there are also normative accounts, and they claim that crises and the way crises are managed actually harm the democratic quality of the EU. In my dissertation, I try to take a different angle, different objectives. I want to look at crises themselves, and especially the outcomes of crisis. So I kind of take crisis as a given and the focus of my study. And then I ask, how can we actually operationalize and also categorize crisis and their outcomes? And finally, this is the main research question: why has there been such variation in crisis outcomes? So I also seek to go beyond this mere assessment in terms of more or less integration in the aftermath and as a result of crisis. Moving now to definitions and cases, crises generally can be considered as focal points of political conflicts and also as decisive and potential turning points. They really bring politics to the fore, and they open different paths for the future of a political system. The crisis literature suggests three broader characteristics of a crisis, namely threat, urgency, and uncertainty. More specifically than crisis of European integration, here I take on a distinction that has been made in the literature between crisis in integration and crisis of integration. Crises in integration are much more common, and crises of integration are much rarer. And the difference is that crises of integration, they affect more than a single member state or a single policy issue, and they are more than temporary decision-making problems or implementation delays. They really go at the heart what European integration or the EU as a polity is about or supposed to be about. So they can be thought of as constitutional, quasi-constitutional, and polity crisis, because they call into question key features, principles, or projects of European integration. Which means central treaty provisions anchored in EU primary law, but also unwritten integration principles, member state relations, and important integration projects. This is the list of cases or crises that I'm looking at. So we have the European Defence Community crisis from the 1950s. We have the empty chair crisis from the 1960s. The British budgetary rebate crisis, late 1970s, early 1980s, the end of Cold War crisis with the major geopolitical shifts at the end of the 1980s, the constitutional treaty crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and the migration crisis. So I would claim that these cases pass the definitional benchmark just as established. And when we look at individual crises, there was also a strong feeling of crisis among contemporary policymakers and observers. These cases display variation both over time and across policy fields. And the one that are highlighted here in bold are the four crises that I'm looking in greater detail, mostly because they indicate variation in their outcomes. In terms
Lucas, now we seem to have lost your volume.
I mainly rely on congruence test, also because of the many case studies that I have and a rather long time frame for each crisis. So with congruence test, the outcome of interest is known ex ante, and the researcher states his or her theoretical expectation and then looks whether the empirical evidence actually matches with the outcome. Where possible, I try to go a bit beyond this, what I call here light process tracing, to really account for the precise sequencing of events and the major actors at play, and look for potential mechanisms and observable implications that then can give further explanatory power for the theorized explanatory factors. In terms of data, I build on the large secondary literature that is out there on each crisis, mostly done by historians, but also political scientists, as well as many primary sources such as EU and national policy documents and the memoirs of policymakers and observers for each of the crises. What I also want to do, and there I have to see to which extent this is feasible, is a content analysis of leading newspaper for the sake of triangulation. I'm moving now to the theoretical framework of the thesis. And first, in terms of outcome categories, I distinguish between 4 possible outcomes. They are derived from the broader political science literature, international relations, EU studies, and comparative politics. And they can be grouped as they express change to the EU system. So transformation means a fundamental restructuring of the system and a reinvention of its basic rules. Adaptation is rather a confirmation of the system and some smaller adjustments. So the overall logic of the system remains. Stagnation is when a system is not replaced by a new system in the aftermath of a crisis. And regression means basically a reduction of the system in the way that the system does not fulfill the same functions anymore. And these categories, I argue, promise to capture both shifts in policy and institutional competences, but also changes in integration principles, the overall integration course and member states relations. So they seek to go beyond this rather simplistic assessment of more or less integration in terms in the aftermath of crisis. Furthermore, I put forward 3 explanatory factors for this variation in crisis outcomes. Again, they are derived from international relations literature, broader crisis literature, and EU theories. The first explanatory factor here relates to the type of shock, because type of shock, I argue, has different implications for the crisis course and its outcome, and for the scale and quality of change that results from a crisis. I theorize or distinguish between exogenous and endogenous crisis origins. An exogenous shock basically has the origin outside the EU polity. It suddenly kicks in and tends to have far-reaching consequences, because the notion of urgency and uncertainty here might be higher than in endogenous shocks, which have their origin inside the EU polity. They might reveal longer-term problems and disputes, and they make more minor changes likely. The other 2 explanatory factors relate to crisis resolution, and here I distinguish between convergence and divergence. And this relates to member states' positions or takes, the positions they take during a crisis. And they assess whether a resolution, a crisis resolution is achieved measured against the situation or the declared objectives at the beginning of the crisis. So the second explanatory factor I put forward is interdependence, and this relates to how strongly member states are affected by crisis and how equally they are affected by crisis. And observable manifestations here would be whether we see something like functional pressure for common action due to common vulnerability of a crisis, if there's a shared feeling of crisis, or if, on the other hand, individual member states have available alternatives to common action, so basically national action, so more promising alternatives than the common action. It generally holds that the higher the level of interdependence as a result of the crisis, the more likely it is that we see convergence in member states' take on the crisis and an interest in a common resolution. Then thirdly, the third explanatory factor is political leadership to actually overcome a crisis. And here I claim that member states are the crucial actors, in particular that the role of France and Germany as founding and the two largest member states is decisive. So political scientists, not least my own supervisor Ulrich Grotz, they have shown that France and Germany have decisively shaped the EU polity and European integration, but they have done so less so with regards to crisis. So obviously, these two countries have available important power resources when it comes to size, but also economic and financial power. We could also put forward ideational power, and they have a unique bilateral relationship, which might be important when it comes to crisis resolution. To do so, they can make use of different strategies, including setting the agenda, forging larger compromises, and build coalition of like-minded member states. It generally holds that if France and Germany develop a joint take on a crisis and take the lead, it is likely that we see a broader convergence and overall convergence of member state positions and a resolution meeting the common objectives voiced at the beginning of a crisis, or actually addressing the crisis reasons. This is just a visualization of, or typology if you want, of the different explanatory factors and the different outcome categories. So a 2x2 table of my theoretical framework. I'm moving on now to preliminary findings. This is just an overview of the, so on the left-hand side, you see the 7 crises that I'm looking at. In the middle column, you see the empirical crisis outcome, and on the right hand, you see the outcome category. So let me quickly go through them. So the crisis of the European defense community was resolved, if you want, in a way that the Western European Union was created. So this was, because it no longer exists, an intergovernmental international alliance instead of a supranational European body. So European defense relied very much on the US and NATO, and measured against the initial ambitions, this rather represents stagnation. The empty chair crisis was resolved in the Luxembourg Compromise, where consensus decision-making and the importance of national veto was stressed, as has been practiced before. So this very much represents an adaptation of the system. Similar for the British budgetary rebate crisis, the end of the Cold War. I claim the basic answer by the EU was the Maastricht Treaty and the creation of a proper union, and there obviously member states gave up their monetary sovereignty. This is not to say that monetary union would not have happened without the end of the Cold War, but the timing and pace and also the design of economic and monetary union was accelerated, probably also facilitated by this crisis. So this very much represents a transformation of the system. In the case of the constitutional treaty that largely failed and then was then replaced by the Lisbon Treaty, we saw another instance of stagnation. In the case of the Eurozone crisis, where the answer item here was EMU 2.0, with the creation of fiscal union and banking union, and also a much more prominent role of the European Central Bank. We saw another instance of transformation, and then finally with the migration crisis, because no proper European internal EU solution, if you want, could be found, but national solutions predominated, and we saw reintroduction of border controls and also an undermining of EU law. This was an instance of regression of the EU system. If time allows, I'm running quickly through 2 crises in a bit more detail, as they could be dealt with in individual chapters of the thesis. So one example here that I want to bring forward is the empty chair crisis, which had its origin in a clash about reform of the common agricultural policy. And then, so this was in June 1965, and France withdrew its minister from the council work, but actually the the broader or main reason was dissatisfaction with a supposed supranationalization of the European Economic Community and the planned transition to majority voting. So this very much represents an endogenous crisis. This, as a theoretical framework would suggest, in case of convergent, would lead to an adaptation of the system. During the crisis, we could see that interdependence between member states were quite high. As it turned out, member states, both economically but also politically, depended very much on a continued membership, and no member states had a more promising or better alternative to continued membership in a reformed European Economic Community. We also see that Franco-German leadership was present. They basically started from opposite poles. So France at the beginning asking for, demanding a treaty change, which Germany strongly opposed. We also saw that the other 4 member states at that time largely rallied behind the German position. And then starting from these opposite poles, they intensified their coordination and eventually leading the way to a common agreement. And this common agreement, as we know, took the form of the Luxembourg Compromise. So it was agreed that there would be no treaty change, but member states stressed and underlined their commitment to consensual decision making. So indeed, this represents kind of an adaptation of the system in the way that the system formally was not changed, but a common practice, namely the national veto, was underlined. So an adaptation through clarification and a reinterpretation, a political reinterpretation of formal treaty provisions. And then finally, another crisis in a bit more detail, the migration crisis, which had its origin in early 2015 with the unprecedented arrival of asylum seekers. And as a consequence, the common European asylum system, as well as the national asylum systems, were overwhelmed, because these events, to a large extent, were beyond the EU's control. This crisis can be captured as an exogenous crisis, and in case of divergent, we should see a regression of the system. During the crisis, interdependence between member states were quite low, because pressures and burdens were asymmetric in a way that a majority of member states were hardly affected. We also see that there were different positions, different opinions on the reasons and the adequate answers to the crisis. And for many member states, national alternatives were more promising than common European action. For example, reintroducing border controls, a policy of waving through, as well as a tightening of national asylum systems. Furthermore, Franco-German leadership was rather absent. There was various instances of unilateral German action that basically backfired, if we think of the suspension of the Dublin rules at the beginning, but then as a reaction to that, basically a correction of that, also the suspension of Schengen, so the reintroduction of border controls and the pushing through of a quota system, which did not work. From the French side, there were also half-hearted advances for reform of Schengen, but in the end it was given little substance. So overall, little Franco-German leadership, and crucially, there was no other actor that was willing or capable of stepping in for finding an internal EU solution to the crisis. Consequently, as an outcome, Common European Asylum System 2.0, what was actually done was an externalization of the problem, of the crisis, and the EU became more vulnerable due to bilateral deals with Turkey and various Western Balkan states. And we see continued national measures and an undermining of EU law. So in the end, regression in the way that the functionality and the scope and application of Common European Asylum System, as well as the Schengen system were reduced. Okay, Daniela, I think I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. And as I was saying, this is very much work in progress. I'm very much looking forward to comments, help, suggestions in the Q&A.
Good. Thank you, Lucas. This was really very interesting and very clear. And I'm sure there will be a lot of comments because I think it's stimulating ideas. So I open the floor for questions and comments. So we can start with Adrien Héritier.
Thank you very much, Lucas, for a very, very interesting presentation of your work, which I was already kind of familiar with, but it's great to see how it progresses. And it's indeed, I think it's quite fascinating. I, of course, have just two questions, maybe. Could you maybe give an explanation why you focus on these particular crises? You would have to give a general explanation of why you choose these types of crises in your work. So that was my first point. The second point is, could you maybe say a little bit more about, you have 4 dimensions of outcomes, which I found very kind of plausible. But could you spell out a little bit more the empirical, more kind of fine-grained empirical indicators for each of these 4 dimensions? How exactly do you recognize regression if you see it, or transformation when you see it? I'm sure you have this in this work. And maybe a small third point, just in order to show that you need such a fine-grained indicators, empirical indicators on the side of the dependent variable as well. When you talk, for instance, about the Luxembourg crisis, the empty chair crisis, Luxembourg compromise, what was so interesting, you kind of already mentioned the most important institutional outcomes, but what you didn't mention, and where in a way something shifted during the empty chair crisis, is while there was, empty chair crisis for a while and nothing happened in terms of legislation, there was an enormous output of comitology, that is delegated legislation. Thanks.
Thank you, Adrien. Lucas?
Yeah. Shall I go straight with
I think so, yes.
Some answers? Okay, thanks a lot, Adrien, for the questions and suggestions. When it comes to case selection, I mean, this is one of the problems, to be very honest, that I'm aware of and that I'm facing. So the initial idea is to have this major crisis of European integration, and to have an exhaustive list of integration crises. I do see the problem that with the definition that I've put forward, probably there are more crises than the 7 that I put forward here. We could think of the economic crisis in the 1970s, then the crisis of the European monetary system, obviously Brexit and Corona more recently. So I'm aware that this probably is still a weak point. And I mean, this criticism has been made before when it comes to my universe of cases. I think I just have to decide if I include more crises that match my definition, but that would also increase the overall number of cases. But I'm not sure if this is feasible, and I'm not sure if this even makes sense. Or I have to state clearly the universe of cases, but then better justify why out of this universe of cases I'm looking at 7 crises. Probably the latter would be the way to go, but I'm aware of that this is still very problematic. In terms of the dependent variable and the outcomes, it is similar. I'm not fully satisfied with this outcome categories myself. I mean, really an aim and an objective that I still very much have, and I think is necessary to make really a contribution to the literature, is to go beyond this more or less integration dichotomy. And this is where these four possible outcomes come in. When it comes to empirical indicators, for example, I think it's not always clear and not very intuitive in the first place where the distinction between adaptation and transformation is. I think here transformation, I really think in terms of quality of change, so large scale change versus more smaller scale change. And transformation here might indicate that something happened because of the crisis that was not possible before. So for example, adaptation as a result of rather endogenous crisis is more a confirmation of practices that have been there before and that might then be codified and stressed, whereas transformation really is more fundamental change. I have to admit, I didn't fully get the comment on the empty chair crisis. What you were saying there. I'm sorry.
Actually, it's quite simple. The argument is just to say you need kind of very specific indicators for measuring what type of change do you get in order to fully grasp what the outcome is. And I gave the one example of the Luxembourg Compromise, where you have the institutional rule, of course, which was accepted then by member states, but it, for instance, it doesn't grasp in that kind of definition of the indicators of the dependent variable, you're not able to grasp that beyond, underneath of legislation, you had an enormous amount of, as it were, delegated legislation taking place, which kept the machine going, right, of European legislation. And that is comitology, right? Mm-hmm. I just wanted to say that your empirical indicators have to be so specific that you are able to grasp these changes as well. That was my point.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. Probably the outcome here only grasped part of the resolution. However, probably the most important part, because the major reason for triggering this crisis, or this crisis from fully unfolding, was related to majority voting and how decision making here is made between member states. So I agree that this probably is only part of the empty chair crisis, but probably the most prominent and, so to say, important part of the crisis.
Okay. I have next Odysseia Konstantinakos.
Thank you very much, Lucas. Very interesting presentation, and the overall project is theoretically ambitious. I'm looking forward to discussing it with you. I have two questions. One is more theoretical on the concepts you're using, and the other one on the empirical findings. I want to start on the very concept of crisis and why you're using this one instead of critical junctures, for example, that goes more into the historical institutionalist literature, and maybe someone would say that it could fit better to explain the outcomes that you're trying to see. And the second question is on a very specific case study on the migration crisis, that the outcome that you identify is regression. And I'm wondering whether this is the case, and because typologies are often absolute, but maybe in reality they're more nuanced, the outcomes. Because in the migration crisis, we had a European solution, we had the EU-Turkey agreement, and we also had the follow-up Valletta summit, after which the EU fund for development, or fund for Africa, was set, which is a new instrument. And also Frontex acquired a more important role in border protection. Now, at the moment, Frontex is actually protecting peripheral borders of the EU, and also they participate in illegal pushbacks. this is a case that's been raised recently. So I see a transformation there. Why not transformation and still regression? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Odysseus, for these 2 points. The first one, yeah, critical juncture. It is similar, and I think some scholars even might use the concept of crisis and critical juncture, or they might not differentiate between the 2 concepts. I think with critical juncture, the problem is that we very often can only say with hindsight if there was a critical juncture present or not. And with crises, it seems to me that there are more clear indicators when we can identify a crisis and not wait for a certain outcome or result and then assess whether there was critical juncture or not. Plus, and I mean this might be more practical reason, I think crises just feature more prominently in the literature. So I might want to stick with this term. With the migration crisis, I mean you're right that we have seen, if you want, various smaller outcomes within the same crisis. So one could argue that, for example, in terms of Frontex and border controls, we've actually seen a shift in competences or resources from the national to the European level. The same holds true actually for the Eurozone crisis. There were different aspects and different policy fields, different smaller results and resolution within the same crisis. But I think what I have when I take the crisis as a given and an overall crisis, I also have to come up with an overall outcome and an overall result. And then I would say overall it is here the case that an EU internal resolution and the things that have been put forward and the commonly or the voiced objectives, if you want, at the beginning of the system. So making the common European asylum system more resilient, preserving Schengen, and the various strategies and instruments that have been put forward to achieve these objectives, they were not met. They were not met. We have seen a reintroduction of border controls. We have seen an undermining of EU institutions, namely the Commission. The proposals were not followed. The ruling of the European Court of Justice that were not followed. So, on balance, I would say, measured against the originally voiced objectives, it was not met, at least in an EU internal dimension. There was an external resolution, if you want, with this deal with Turkey, but again, it's first it's an externalization of the problem, and the EU has become very vulnerable as a result. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Next, I have Tamara Tubakovic.
Thanks very much. That was a really interesting presentation, Lucas. Thanks very much. I'm sort of interested in how you're characterizing endogenous or exogenous crises. And I'm thinking here in particular to the migration crisis. And in your presentation, you described it as an exogenous crisis due to the inflows of migrants. But I'm sort of wondering, to what extent, was it not also an endogenous crisis due to quite a long history of failed reforms and institutional development, since it was introduced by the Maastricht and Amsterdam Treaty. So I'm sort of just interested here how you sort of decided that was an exogenous type of crisis. And that sort of links to my second question, which is, do you look at all at, for example, like pre-existing sort of integration developments to explain the outcomes? Because migration, the asylum migration field has been historically characterized by quite weak integration and continued sort of intergovernmental dynamics or gaps in integration. So I was just, wondering if you also looked at that in terms of your explanations. And then I had a third very quick point when you were just talking, and maybe I misunderstood in your last comment, about the way you're sort of defining integration. And I apologize if I misunderstood, but I was actually interested because you were sort of describing the EU-Turkey agreement and the external sort of dimensions as showing regression into integration, when I think some scholars have actually, particularly in the new intergovernmentalist sort of school, actually still see that as a form of integration, just not more supranationalism. So yeah, I thought maybe if you could comment on that one as well, but thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, Tamara, for this comments. When it comes to endogenous, exogenous, again, I think it's not always crystal clear, this distinction, and probably the crisis could only fully unfold to such a large scale because the common European asylum system was ill-prepared, if you want. The same basically holds true for economic monetary union, so the Eurozone. I think the Eurozone crisis could only fully explode because there were obviously some shortcomings. However, both when it comes to the Eurozone crisis and when it comes to the migration crisis, I would still say that this was an exogenous crisis in a way that these policy regimes had not been tested before to such a large scale and in such a short time. So I would say the trigger actually that made these two crises fully unfolding, they were outside the polity. And my argument here is with exogenous, because I had these three characteristics of crisis: threat, uncertainty, and urgency. And especially when it comes to urgency, but probably also when it comes to uncertainty, I think they are qualitatively different and probably higher in cases of exogenous crisis, because they happen that fast and on such a large scale. So when it comes to the trigger of the crisis, I would say migration was an exogenous crisis. Your second comment was really interesting, and this is something that I have to take into account. So if I got you right, you were saying that integration wasn't that advanced in the field of migration anyways, and it was very much done on an intergovernmental level. This is true, and I have to take this into account. I think when it comes to policy regime, migration and asylum, integration is not as advanced as is the case with economic and monetary union. And that probably also explains why the level of interdependence was lower in the migration crisis compared to the Eurozone crisis. I tend to agree. I think what neo-functionalists probably would call functional pressure tend to be higher in the case of the Eurozone than in the field of asylum and migration. So thank you for that. I think I have to take this into account in order to really make an argument here, because if pressures in the first place are low in one policy field, we should not be surprised that in the case of a crisis, interdependence is also low. Okay.
The next, Bruno De Witte, and then Brigitte Laffa. Bruno, please.
Thank you, Daniele, and thank you, Lucas, for your interesting presentation. I'd like to make three little comments. One is on your research design. So what happens if there's a shock coming towards Europe, towards European Union, and the European Union adapts quickly, almost immediately? So there is never a crisis in the way you define it. There's no crisis in European integration or of European integration, because adaptation came quickly. Let me give you the example of the COVID crisis. So clearly a crisis in the world outside, there's no doubt about it. Has it led to a crisis in European integration? Not so sure. One can debate about it. And why can one debate about it? Is because the reaction of the European Union came rather quickly. There was an adaptation, if you want, of the system to deal with COVID. So what it means, I think, for your research design is that sometimes something doesn't become a crisis precisely because the European Union has adapted. And then, so adaptation can then not be the outcome of a crisis because it has happened before the crisis. So I'm wondering how you deal with a situation like that. And then I had two comments on your findings. One is on the specific case of the constitutional treaty crisis. So you describe the outcome as stagnation. I'm not so sure about that, because what happened in the constitutional treaty crisis is that the member states managed to save basically all the reforms of the constitutional treaty, but put them under a different heading. You know, you're right to say that the outcome was the Lisbon Treaty, which was like an ordinary revision treaty, shedding the constitutional language, but preserving actually almost all the content, all the reforms that had been included in the constitutional treaty. So for the European integration process, this was not stagnation. This was reform, further integration, comparable to what happened maybe in the Maastricht Treaty. So I'm wondering about your classification there of the constitutional treaty crisis. And then the final point is, again, on the categories, the distinction between transformation and adaptation. And I think I agree with trying to distinguish them, but it's not easy. You say transformation is when something fundamental happens in the system. Yeah, when do we know that something fundamental happens? I've been struggling that myself, and there's been a whole discussion actually among also legal scholars in relation to the Eurozone crisis, where many people have said the Eurozone crisis has led to a major transformation or mutation of the EU constitutional system. In my own writing, I've taken a rather different position in saying that what we've seen here is more adaptation, you know, is that the system has adapted itself to the crisis without being fundamentally transformed. And one indicator, of course, an easy indicator, is to see whether there have been treaty revisions. In this case, not, you know, hardly anything. So the EU has coped with the Eurozone crisis in this incremental way, you know, building on existing mechanisms, trying some new ones, but in a sort of informal way without changing the fundamentals of the system. So that makes it really difficult, I think, to decide whether what happened is transformation or adaptation. I don't want to make your life difficult, but I think you realize, you're aware yourself of the fact that it's not always easy to you know, to put a crisis outcome in one box or the other. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. Lucas?
Thanks a lot, Bruno, for this three very valuable, important comments that will definitely make me think way beyond this seminar. No, I mean, you really pointed at three things that I'm not entirely clear myself yet, and I have to think about it. Let me try still to give at least some preliminary answers. So the first one, when it comes to design and the EU's reaction to the COVID pandemic, well, I would say it was a crisis in the first place because it was a global public health crisis. It didn't probably, I would agree that it didn't turn into a full crisis of European integration, also partly because of the very quick reactions that the European Union has adapted, as you were saying. According to my theoretical framework, in case of an exogenous crisis, we should see transformation here. And I think there are signs of transformation when it comes to the recovery fund. So basically a separate budget outside the regular budget, raising money on a very large scale in the financial markets, grants instead of loans. So I think there are indications of a transformation in a way, as I define transformation, that strategies or policies are adopted that were not possible before. So without the COVID-19 pandemic, I don't think that debt debt-financed and grants-based recovery fund would have been possible, and large fiscal transfers between member states. I mean, direct payments instead of loans. So maybe we can still see a form of transformation here. The Constitutional Treaty, I think it's another example of how we assess outcomes. I'm aware of the literature that should suggest that the Lisbon Treaty was actually a step in European integration, and it was an adaptation, or at least not a stagnation as I define it by, but my approach here really is to assess a crisis outcome against previous ambitions or the situation at the beginning of the crisis. And here the idea when the European Convention was launched was really to go beyond this intergovernmental conferences only, to have the broader public and interest groups involved, and also to officially and on paper turn the European Union into more like a state-like polity, if you want. And this was given up. These ambitions were given up. It was an intergovernmental conference in the end that approved the Lisbon Treaty, and state-like symbols and provisions were removed. So in this regard, I interpret as a way that member states basically went back to the Nice practice, and there was no new system in a way of a possible constitution would have represented a new system. So there was no new system that was replacing another one. So this is why I think of the resolution of the Constitutional Treaty crisis rather as a stagnation. And then lastly, the distinction between transformation and adaptation, that is obviously tricky. So you were arguing it's rather an adaptation instead of transformation. I think it comes down to what Adrien was suggesting, that I have to provide more clear and empirical indicators of my individual outcomes. I would say when it comes to establishment of something like a fiscal union, so de facto bailing out, when it comes to the role of the ECB, that is a de facto lender of last resort, it very much comes close to a transformation, and really an EMU 2.0 that is substantially different from what was there before. And maybe one way of measuring or determining whether there's a transformation or adaptation is if member states' positions and what they think is the right way to go change in the course of the crisis. And I think this has happened in the Eurozone crisis. So before something like the European Stability Mechanism, or again, the role of the ECB or the change of the role of the ECB. So allowing more or less monetary financing was not possible. And this became only possible in the course and because of the crisis. So I tend to stick with transformation. Thank you.
Okay, Brigitte Laffan is next.
Thank you, and thank you, Lucas, for a great paper and very interesting work. But I want to push you again on the analytical purchase you get from the endogenous-exogenous distinction, on which you're placing a lot of weight in terms of if it's exogenous, you expect transformation. But firstly, I think there is a challenge in that distinction for some of the crises that you've outlined. So yes, the trigger for the Eurozone crisis was the global financial crisis. But the way that crisis manifested itself in the Eurozone was all to do with problems in the regime itself. In other words, the US had a global financial crisis, the UK had, but it manifested itself differently because of the nature of the regime in the EU, and the same could be said for the migration for the migration crisis. In other words, the outcomes are not because the crisis was exogenous, but rather the way in which an exogenous trigger manifests itself in the EU with the regimes it has, it triggers the crisis response. So I remain to be convinced that you get a lot of an analytical purchase from the distinction. Also, if you look at, for example, Brexit Brexit was an endogenous crisis to the EU. It was a country leaving. But in fact, the way the EU framed it to itself was, this is exogenous. The UK is a third country in the making. And it began to treat the UK as an outsider almost immediately. So again, I'm not sure that you're getting the kind of analytical purchase that from this distinction. And I think it also complicates some of the empirical analysis. Secondly, on the Cold War crisis, the end of the Cold War crisis, I'm just from your description, is what you're talking about German unification as a crisis? Or is it the entire collapse of communism in the eastern half of the continent, to which you would also have to add enlargement as part of the crisis response? So this is simply, it's not clear to me what crisis, what you mean by in terms of that crisis. And then thirdly, I wonder whether it might, in terms of developing indicators of what is regression, transformation, stagnation, whether or not you need to bring, so you began by saying crises bring politics to the fore, but then in your explanation of outcomes, I don't see much politics at all. And I'm wondering whether, in addition to interdependence, you need to also begin to think about asymmetric impact, because the outcome of the Eurozone crisis in terms of the layering of all these additional mechanisms, that was an outcome of German power. It was the asymmetry between the creditors and the debtors driven by Germany. So I'm wondering, is there enough power and politics in the way in which you explain the outcomes? But it's great work.
Lucas?
Thank you, Bridget. Very helpful indeed. So you pointed again at the distinction between endogenous, exogenous. Yeah, maybe, I mean, since it was raised a couple of times, maybe I should really rethink this. I mean, the motivation, I guess it's clear. I wanted to have a systematic approach and basically move away from this every crisis is different, and really to go into more a broader pattern, a broader picture, and have a number of common outcomes. And therefore I also came up with this 2x2 table, and I was actually pushed by various people to go into this 2x2 table, because first, it helps, I think, me as a researcher to kind of systematize the thinking and the empirical material that is out there. But it might also be better for readers or listeners to kind of follow and see my way of thinking and how I operationalize and categorize this different crises and the outcomes, which means if I want to stick to this 2x2, I mean, it doesn't have to be 2x2, but if I want to stick to this 2x2, I need variation or distinction on two axes. And one axis was or is this crisis origin and this distinction between endogenous and exogenous. I mean, it features quite prominently in the literature, not only historical institutionalism, but also IR scholars have made this distinction between exogenous crises that tend to evolve faster and on a larger scale, and hence have more far-reaching consequences. But of course, you were right, and I think it's related to what Tamara was saying with regards to migration crisis. So you pointed at the Eurozone crisis, which was not fully exogenous, but also endogenous, because the Eurozone was ill-prepared. Yeah, I will definitely need to discuss then the distinction between endogenous and exogenous. When it comes to Cold War, yeah, I should have been more explicit. So the end of Cold War crisis in broader terms, I think of the major geopolitical shifts, but in the first place, EU internal consequences, which is, as you were saying, the prospect of German reunification. So I'm not more into this broader debates, the fall of communism and later on dissolution of Yugoslavia, etc., etc. So more the internal dimension of a larger, bigger Germany, and what this meant for internal power politics and how to cope with this new post-war situation within the EU. There was a third comment on the indicators for outcomes. I'm not sure if I fully understood. You were saying that I claim crisis bring politics to the fore, but then in the outcomes and the way I frame or define the outcomes, there's little politics. Is that right? But
I think my one of your important independent variables is interdependence.
mm-hmm.
But I think asymmetry really matters as well. So it wasn't clear to me what the relationship was between interdependence across member states and asymmetry of impact of the crisis. But that's.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand, and I think it's actually related. So when there is an asymmetric impact because of a crisis, as was the case with migration, where half of the EU member states were hardly affected by the migratory flows, I think interdependence tends to be low. So this asymmetric impact and the level of interdependence, I think they are related. Yeah.
But the question was about power, Bridget, right?
I mean, I have these two independent variables that on a very general level are derived from neo-functionalism, which is interdependence, and more intergovernmentalism, which is political leadership. And I think of this interdependence in terms of the effect that a crisis has. So to which extent are member states affected and how equally they are affected. And this determines the level of interdependence. And I think of power in terms of leadership, and here the role in particular of the largest member states. Are they willing and capable of taking the lead and forge compromises, build coalition in order to stimulate, if you want, a convergence of member states' positions in the course of a crisis.
Okay. Could I just come in here, because I had my hand raised, and my question would relate to the 2x2 table, and you mentioned this. So Anya, can you bear with me just for a second? I think it's a good point for me to ask this question, or actually ask for a clarification, because I was a bit confused by that table. It wasn't really clear to me what the goal is. As it is presented as 2x2 table, it looks like a typology. So you have these two dimensions, which the endogenous, exogenous distinction, and then the what was it? The asymmetry. Correct?
Well, it's crisis resolution in a way, so convergence, divergence of member states' takes on the crisis.
All right. So you have these two dimensions, you cross them and you get the four types. That's how it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
But then in the presentation before that, and then now also in the answers, these factors, endogeneity and so on, you use them as explanatory factors. So I'm not sure if that table is actually, I don't know, formulating almost a hypothesis that if the crisis is endogenous, then the outcome is more likely to be X and Y. To me, it was not clear how you use that. Maybe you can clarify.
But on the one axis, there is the distinction between exogenous and endogenous. So, and I have four possible outcomes overall. And if there is exogenously triggered crisis, two outcomes are likely: transformation, regression. So this suggests, in case of an exogenous crisis, we are likely to see in terms of outcome, transformation, or regression.
So it is explanatory factors.
Yeah.
Well, then it cannot be a typology. Then you cannot use them to build your typology. It seems to me that the four types need to be derived by something else than the independent variable that then you use to explain their variation.
Mm. Yeah, sorry. Well, could you help me out maybe here? So you were saying if it is an but the type itself is not exogenous. The explanatory factor, or one of the explanatory factor, is crisis origin. And I theorize, or I argue, that depending on whether the crisis trigger, the crisis origin, is exogenous, endogenous, a certain crisis outcomes becomes more likely than the other.
Yes.
But the outcome itself is not exogenous or exogeneity.
No, but you define the type by being exogenous or endogenous, by building the 2x2 table. You by saying, I don't have the table in front of me, so I'm going blind, but by saying transformation is endogenous, because you say transformation as a type must be endogenous and, let's say, asymmetric. I don't remember, but by saying that, you define the type by having those properties, those features. Then it's a bit strange to say that if a crisis is endogenous, then it causes, or it's more likely to lead to a transformation.
So you are suggesting that there has to be a step between, yes, like with the other two factors. So I say that the level of interdependence and the presence or absence of political leadership by certain actors determine whether there's convergence or divergence. And in terms of crisis origin, it means that exogenous or endogenous has certain implications or manifestations, and these then determine a certain crisis outcome.
Yes, I cannot do it like this because I don't have the table in front of me, and it's one of those cases. It would be good to be in the same room and have a whiteboard and write on it. And probably we could do it if I were a bit more technological, but yes, something like that. And I mean, take it as a suggestion to think about it, not but to me, if you build a typology with two factors, those factors are the features of the four types that you obtain. I don't think you can then use those same factors as explanatory variables, because the variation on those factors define the four types. But
Daniela,
maybe we sit down with
if I may, yes.
And we go through. But to me, that table was not clear in the sense: is it a typology, or is it something that you use to formulate hypotheses? But we can leave it at this. I don't want to take too much time. Maybe we move on to Anya Thomas.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lucas. It's very, very interesting. My reflections go perhaps a bit into the same direction. I'm wondering how you can get over this problem that you have crisis everywhere in your case selection, in your independent variables, and then also even, let's say, in your outcomes, because there are people who would perhaps define crisis as something that has a certain outcome with as opposite to a turbulence, for example. I mean, there's this debate: is something just a turbulence or is it a crisis? And I was wondering, I mean, I'm just reflecting here, if you cannot have, I don't know, a sort of neutral way for your case selection. I don't know, choose your cases through, I don't know, the frequency of European Council meetings or something external to what you want to explain that can help you to do the case selection, so that nobody will come and say you do the case selection on the dependent variable. This also relates to something which my feeling is that perhaps your definition of crisis, I mean, that relates to many things that have been said before, and I certainly don't have the solution, but your definition of crisis is still very broad. It's threat, urgency, and uncertainty. So we do not really know for whom, for which actors. I mean, exogenous, endogenous, we have already discussed that. I wonder if you don't need to come up with a narrow definition of crisis, or perhaps only focus on institutional crisis or something. And that also relates to the time frames for your crisis, because, for example, the migration crisis is not a crisis which is over. As I understand you are interested in the institutional crisis that we had at the moment, at this moment, which we usually define as migration crisis, but we're still in a migration crisis. So I think there are some, also in terms of the timings of these different crises, things that you could define more clearly. And then I have a very practical question. I mean, you for the time being, you do a comparison of 7 cases, which is quite a lot. Perhaps you could, I mean, I don't know if we have the time, but I would be really interested in knowing how you use your sources. I mean, if I get it right, you do archive analysis, because you said, I mean, what my question is triggered by the fact that you said you will perhaps also do newspaper analysis, and I was wondering in how far the newspaper analysis will triangulate something in for your cases, and then how can you do such an enormous amount of archive research and newspaper analysis on 7 cases? And wouldn't it be worth to choose, I mean, to come up with this rationale for case selection and then to choose only 4 cases and go more in depth? But you've certainly reflected on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Anja. Quite a lot of points and interesting points. We'll try to answer them. Let me start maybe with a neutral way a more neutral way of case selection, in order not to select on the dependent variable. Well, the dependent variable is yeah, okay, it's crisis outcomes, but it's these 4 categories. Crisis itself is, it's true, I take them as a given, as a starting point, as the focus of analysis, but it's not a dependent variable. So in the case of migration crisis, the dependent variable is not the migration crisis, but the resolution of the migration crisis, the outcome of the migration crisis. And related to definition of crisis, I mean, in the first step, I was referring to the broader crisis literature that suggests 3 characteristics: threat, urgency, uncertainty. But then I tried to narrow it a bit more down to crisis in European integration, which again are less than overall crisis, but still there are quite a lot of crises in European integration. Then crisis of European integration really affect the EU as a polity. So constitutional like crisis. And I was saying, but probably this is still too broad. So this can affect certain provisions that are in EU primary law, so certain treaty provision, but it can also relate to projects that have been deemed important for the European integration process, but that never materialized. So the European Defense Community, the Constitutional Treaty. So I think I also have to include them, although they never materialize. But you're completely right that the definition still needs more work. With the migration crisis, indeed, some people would argue that it is not fully resolved, and I tend to agree. However, I think for the sake of clarity, for the sake of the argument, what I'm doing in the thesis is try to be really clear on a precise starting point of a crisis and a precise endpoint of a crisis. And in the case of the migration crisis, it could either be when the EU-Turkey deal was signed and the idea of resolving this crisis internally was abandoned for the sake of an externalization of the problem, or it could be when the quota, so the internal relocation of refugees, was expired, basically, because the quota was temporarily for 2 years, and it was agreed in September 2015, it expired in September 2017, and there it became obviously that this way of handling the crisis did not work, because I think only 10% of the supposed to be allocated refugees were eventually relocated. So what I'm trying to say, I think it's still clear and or possible and also necessary to have a clear finishing point or end point of a crisis, and I think this is feasible. I mean, I'm just indicating of 2 possible points where we can say, okay, the migration crisis came to an end, although it is an ongoing process, of course. Then when it comes to cases, it's true that I list 7 cases, but I was also highlighting 4 of them in bold because they suggest variation, and they suggest the 4 crisis outcome categories that I was suggesting. And these are actually the 4 that I look more into detail for within case explanation, but I want to do a bit more and also do cross case comparison. So basically I have 4 crises that I look into in more detail to highlight the 4 possible crisis outcomes, but then also engage in a cross case comparison, including these other 3 cases. And then finally, when it comes to data, I mean, I was very eager to do archival work. I think it's just not possible, and probably also not necessary, because the historians already have done quite a lot of work, and I definitely cannot compete with that, and there's no real need. The idea with this newspaper assessment is to really have, for the sake of triangulation, right? So I don't want to rely entirely on what other people did. I have the secondary literature, and there is quite a lot of literature on every crisis. Plus I have primary documents, EU level documents, but also national documents, and memoirs of contemporary policymakers. It was just an idea to do yet another step for the sake of triangulation and get a fuller and also more balanced picture. But I'm very happy to hear your thoughts on that, if this is necessary and the way it could be done.
Quickly, Anya.
Yeah, no, it's I'm a bit puzzled how you can get to what you want to know through newspaper analysis, because what you get is, I mean, it's like the representation of what things which are going on, or you can get an idea about. I mean, for me, newspapers, for example, might be a way to select crisis events, because you could do like a metrics about, I don't know, the word crisis that was used on a certain issue, and you could say, okay, this is how I define my crisis. It's like publicly recognized crisis in public debate. But I do not really see how through newspapers you can say something about I mean, what is going on in the European Council, the crisis resolution, the power games.
Yeah, for sure not. I mean, there the added value would be limited, but it could be, maybe I should say, press reports instead of this newspaper content analysis. But an idea could be to have a look at the entries of Agence Europe that has been there since the beginning. It's just a way to make sure that I'm not missing out on important events and actors, and there might also be some more additional quotes than that are already there, thanks to the secondary literature, which is quite broad on every crisis, I have to say. But it was just been another way of bringing in more sources and make sure that I have a fuller picture.
Yeah, perhaps it might be worthwhile to cut your cases down and to do a little bit more of archive research then, or but okay, with the sources you quoted, that might be possible perhaps for the FT, or but you'd read really informed newspaper sources here.
Tamara has one more point.
Sorry, yeah, if I could just ask, perhaps like you could do interviews as your sort of third point for triangulation. Just from my personal experience, I did interviews with policymakers. My work looks at the migration crisis. And so I sort of just asked questions in terms of seeing how they explained the outcome, or how they explained the, I guess, lack of integration that you're talking about in this policy area, or just sort of to get their perspectives, you know, and then you could sort of see how that compares to what you find in the other data that you draw upon. I mean, of course, you know, interviews have their own sort of issues because they are also presenting a representation, but it might just be a sort of third point as well. Perhaps.
But that would be very much limited to the more recent crisis than for
of course,
practical reasons.
Yeah, and I mean, you do have the memoirs as well, perhaps for the older crisis. But I'm just saying, like, for me, it was quite fruitful. Of course, my research design was different, but it was useful to see what they considered as factors or explanatory sort of things to explain certain outcomes.
Yeah. I mean, I did quite a lot of interviews in the last half year for kind of different side projects on the COVID-19 crisis, and obviously interviews they have their added value, and it gives you a different picture, and probably also more complete picture. But for the sake of this PhD project, it could probably only be then related to the Eurozone crisis, migration crisis, and it would take a lot of extra time and resources. But it could be a way to go, as you were saying, because I mean, it could indeed be a way to, because the archives, they are closed for this 30 years, so we know quite a lot of stuff thanks to the historians, what happened in the 15s, 60s, 70s, and now also 80s, but 90s and the early 2000s are still closed or partly closed. So that might be a way to compensate via interviews or other techniques that we as political scientists are a bit more familiar with. Thanks.
Okay, it is past 2 p.m. and the seminar must come to an end. Thank you very much, Lucas, for a thought-provoking session. It has been truly stimulating, and I'm grateful to you for making it possible. And thank you everyone for a very interesting discussion and for your comments. So Lucas, you received a lot of comments, obviously, and a lot of suggestions. This is for you now to think about and then decide what makes sense jointly with your supervisor. And anyway, we wish you good luck with the dissertation. It's certainly something very, very interesting. We reconvene after the Easter break, and we will have another seminar of the EU Studies Working Group. And the speaker will be Ruven Simank with a paper on European solidarity in times of crisis. And hopefully I will see many of you again for another seminar. I should say that after Easter, we will, or the seminar series will take a more interdisciplinary turn with sessions also coming from historians and legal scholars. This is something that is important for EGPP, is that it is not only political science or European studies, it has a broader disciplinary take on Europe and European politics. I wish everyone a good and productive Easter break. Stay safe and see you in April. Bye-bye.